inform. We aim to inform, but we also, when possible, aim to advocate. And perhaps that's something that the society has not done as much as it could in the past. But we're also, even as I say, and I celebrate all these achievements, we are very, very aware that we must do more. We must ask hard questions, and this year is a fantastic occasion to, and indeed this event is a fantastic starting point for these conversations and these examinations of our purposes and in this learning from others, from you. Sorry, that's my pussycat. How might the JHSE grow and include rising generations amongst its members? How might it contribute to public debate? Well, we need your ideas, as I say, and more broadly, I think it's perfectly legitimate to ask, what is Jewish history for? Who is it for? Is it part of British history? Is it something else? And I'm just really encouraged by the fact that the recent excitement around and the very achievement of the erection of the statue of Lycorisha, that 13th century woman from Winchester, in the center of Winchester, and there was a big event about that last weekend that some of us attended. I think it's really instructive. There is interest and there is passion. That is Lycorisha as imagined, and her son at her side, Asher. So I'm going to finish here. Those are just a few thoughts coming from me, and moving on, just to introduce our speakers this evening, just very short papers, just each an aspect of the events that happened 130 years ago. David Jacobs, who many of you know, who's an historian and a community organizer, member of the JHSE Advisory Board now, once the chair of the trustees, or the version of the trustees that existed under another name in the past. I simply cannot list. There is not time, was enough time to list all the ways in which David has been a fantastic contributor to the JHSE, and I must say a great supporter of myself in the role I inhabit. Then we'll move on to Caroline Gurney, who's a PhD student in history at the University of Bristol and a member of the JHSE New Generation Group. Then on to Dean Irwin, who finished his PhD just a few years ago. He's an historian and a member of the JHSE Advisory Board. And we're joined from Israel by Pinchas Roth, who's simply a fantastic historian of medieval England, extremely innovative. And he's at Bar-Ilan University. And I was looking for a title for you, Pinchas, and I just called you Friend of the JHSE, because I always feel that whenever we turn to you, you're always very willing, like this evening. So we're going to move now to David to begin, and I am going to change the slideshow out of my own into his own, and I hope that'll all happen without mishap and very elegantly. So I'm going to share. Is that all good? Is that good? Can somebody answer?
Perfect.
Lovely. Okay, I'm just going to move that back. And over to you, David Jacobs. David, are you muted?
Is that better?
That's very better, very much better. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Not at all.
So I was delighted to have this opportunity of making this short presentation about Lucien Wolf, and all the material comes from my own collection, which was mentioned earlier by Miri. Often people see me in my study here with my books around me and behind me, and it's from those books that I derive this information about Lucien Wolf. So next slide, please. So here is Lucien. Lucien Wolf was born in London on the 20th of January, 1857. He was a historian, journalist, and communal leader. His father came from the Habsburg Empire and was a pipe manufacturer. He attended Gloucester House Kew, school called Neumagens, and then Highbury College, finishing his education at Athene Royal in Brussels, and the Institut Rosenfield in Paris, and he was fluent in French and German. Next slide, please. This is his extraordinary, impressive entry in the Who's Who in British Jewry in the Jewish Yearbook, 5th edition for the period 1900 to 1901. Comparing with the rabbi above, a very significant rabbi of the Mahziki Hadass synagogue founded a few years earlier. And look at the size of this entry. Gives you all kinds of interesting details. I'll just pick out a few, that he was the first and foremost, the guiding light, founder and first president of our society. He was a fellow of the Institute of Journalists, the sub-editor and leader writer of the Jewish World, the foreign sub-editor and leader writer of the Daily Graphic. Those were important journals of the time. We now only have the Jewish Chronicle. Oh, and we have the Jewish News as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about Lucien and the slides to come. So next slide, please. This is from the Jewish Chronicle Color magazine of March the 26th, 1982, mere 40 years ago. This is an article about the group of figures known as the Wanderers. Wolf was one of these wanderers, a brilliant brotherhood, Myer Dominitz describes them as, of Israel Abrahams, Joseph Jacob, Solomon Schechter, Solomon J. Solomon, Wolf and Zangwill, Israel Zangwill that is. They met in Kilburn in the home of the then editor of the Jewish Chronicle, Asher Myers, and so frequently did they wander from the topic being discussed amid the fragrant clouds of tobacco smoke that they came to call themselves the Wandering Jews. Next slide, please. This is from Vanity Fair in 1911, a cartoon of Lucien Wolf. Wolf specialized in writing about foreign affairs and wrote regular columns for the Fortnightly Review under the pseudonym Diplomaticus. And you can just about make out under his arm, holding close to his chest, one of the subjects there is Persia. And if you turn your head slightly, the other one in his left hand is Morocco. So Morocco. So he really was an important person of the time. He was foreign editor, as I said, of the influential Daily Graphic. He edited the Jewish World. This is where his journalistic career had begun. He contributed an article on anti-Semitism in the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica and expressed his concern at Tsarist persecution of the Jews in his editorship of the bulletin Darkest Russia. Next slide, please. As a prominent historian of the time, he organized with his historian and fellow wanderer, Joseph Jacobs, no relation, the Anglo-Jewish Historical Exhibition of 1887 held at the Royal Albert Hall. The three aims of the organizers was to promote a knowledge of Anglo-Jewish history, to create a deeper interest in its records and relics, and to aid in their preservation, to determine the extent of the materials which exist for the compilation of a history of the Jews in England. Next, please. There were a number of publications associated with the exhibition, as well as the catalogue that you've just seen. Here is the Bibliotheca Anglo-Judaica, a bibliographical guide to Anglo-Jewish history, again by Jacobs and Wolf, in which they attempted to bring together the raw materials of the history of the Jews in England in a systematic and accessible way. There was indeed a compilation of the papers read at the exhibition, including one by Wolf entitled The Middle Age of Anglo-Jewish History, 1290 to 1656. And lastly, the Shtarot, the Hebrew deeds of English Jews before 1290, edited at the request of the committee of the Anglo-Jewish Historical Exhibition by my great-great-uncle, Myer David Davis, who we're going to hear about later. Next slide, please. This report from the first volume of the Transactions of the Society informs us of the inauguration of our society on Saturday, June the 3rd, 1893. Lucien Wolf occupied the chair and became the society's first president. The Jewish Chronicle reported that the work will be of a twofold character. On the one hand, there will be scientific and scholarly research. On the other, popular exposition. The promoters of the new society proposed that research and publications of the society shall deal exclusively with Anglo-Jewish history. Interestingly, Frederick David Mercator, who we'll come to later, and Claude Goldschmidt Montefiore argued for an extension of the sphere of the work. Next slide, please. Here you can see the leadership of the society. All the wanderers are there, and including the religious leaders representing the Orthodox and the Reformed communities that existed. So on the right-hand column of the council, you've got the Reverend Dr. Lowy and the Reverend Professor David Wolfe Marks. David Wolfe Marks was the founding rabbi of West London, and you can see you've got on the left-hand column, you've got the Reverend H. Golantz, who was the minister of the New West End Synagogue, I think, or Bayswater, one of the two, and the Reverend Dr. Adler, who was the chief rabbi at that time. And you've got all the others, you've got Zangwill, and these were the leaders of the society at the time. Next slide, please. This is the first publication of Lucien Wolf's research in 1901. In his preface, Wolf writes that the preparation of the volume was a labor of love. Nothing, he adds, in the whole course of a varied literary career extending over nearly 30 years has fascinated me so much as the story of the return of the Jews to England. Next slide, please. These records contain a calendar of the Jewish cases recorded in the Butte collection of manuscripts, formerly belonging to the Holy Office of the Inquisition in the Canary Islands, together with an introduction analyzing the work of the Inquisition and explaining its relation to general Jewish history. Wolf was assisted in this work by his fellow wanderer, Dr. Israel Abrahams of Cambridge, and the Marquis of Bute was a member of the society. Next slide, please. And so, to where I was this morning, this is Lucien Wolf's grave in Willesden Cemetery. Next slide, please. You can see on his gravestone, it says, a founder of the Jewish Historical Society of England. Our society, as a tribute to its founder, made itself responsible for the tombstone erected over his grave. This was dedicated the following year by Chief Rabbi Hertz, who helped prepare the inscription. And the Hebrew above says, a wise man and a ready writer, chief of the historians of Anglo-Jewry, wonderful in counsel and great in achievement, a faithful spokesman of his people who sought the welfare of all his brethren. Next slide, please. I made a little postscript. This is Frederick David Mercator, This is an illustration from the graphic in Anne and Roger Cowan's book, Victorian Jews Through British Eyes. He was president of the Anglo-Jewish Historical Exhibition and founded what became the Mercator Library at University College London. Next slide, please. I'm fortunate to have retrieved his prayer book from a skip. I will not embarrass the community as to where I found it, but it was in a skip. Lastly, my last slide. This is from Chaim Bermant's book, The Cousinhood, published more than 50 years ago. In it, he says that one of the results of the Anglo-Jewish Historical Exhibition at the Albert Hall was the formation of the Jewish Historical Society. Frederick David Mercator doubted whether such a society could flourish. The Jews of England, he believed, were mainly commercial people, brokers, merchants, a class of people to whom I essentially belonged. I have no doubt they were a very respectable sort of people, but there is very little concerning them that is interesting to the general public. Bermant continues that Mercator was correct in his observations, but mistaken in his prognostications. The JHSE is still in being and flourishing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much, David. That was elegant, informative, extremely moving, I found. And how wonderful that you visited Willesden just this morning and were able to see the tomb there. Absolutely. Well, in that case, we're moving on really, really swiftly to the sort of almost like a sort of twin piece with yours, which is, so what did the world think about this? So we're moving on to Caroline Gurney, who's prepared this very, really lovingly prepared her own presentation about those early days.
Thank you, Miri. Good evening, everybody. It may surprise some of you to learn that the idea of a Jewish Historical Society was first proposed in 1859, 34 years before the eventual foundation. Reading newspaper reports over this period, which document the anticipation, disappointment, difficulties, and ultimate triumph of the founders, I was struck by the analogy to the birth of a long-desired and much-delayed child. Over the next few minutes, I will take you from the first attempts at conception through a phantom pregnancy and the shame of barrenness to the pain of the birth itself, all happily forgotten in the afterglow of a successful delivery. In late 1859, the Jewish Chronicle serialized Manasseh ben Israel's humble address to Oliver Cromwell. This prompted the anonymous gleaner to write, suggesting the establishment of an Anglo-Jewish Historical Society. Its object would be to collect and print or reprint documents about the Jewish community post-1655, and its profits will be used to fund scholarships for poor Jewish children. Gleaner offered his own collection as the seed to beget the new society. A later reference in the JC suggests that he may even have entrusted these documents to the editor. Certainly, the paper promoted the idea. It urged, "Let us have such a society, that it may roll away from us the disgrace which this culpable indifference to our own past brings on us." And it published a letter asking those interested to send in their addresses so that they could be invited to a meeting. But alas, nothing came of this initial enthusiasm. Those interested in Anglo-Jewish history would have to wait 9 years longer than Abraham and Sarah for the birth of their promised child. In January 1886, the idea resurfaced in the Jewish world with coordinated letters from Lucien Wolff and Alfred Newman, supported by an editorial composed by Wolff himself. The JC took up the theme in the context of the Anglo-Jewish Historical Exhibition, as we've heard, which took place in 1887. In July 1886, it published a lengthy article arguing that the exhibition would only be truly successful if it led to the establishment of a society. Complaining that the first attempt to write a history of Anglo Jewry had been made not in England, but in Germany, the writer observed, "Fortunately, the measure of possible discredit has not been quite filled. Dr. Goldschmidt, if he is not an Englishman, is at least a Jew." The article proposed an ambitiously wide remit for the society, directing and evaluating research, establishing an archive and a museum, and even preserving Jewish funerary monuments. In response, a letter from C expressed an ardent desire for such a society and proposed a series of conferences on Anglo-Jewish history as a precursor to its formation. The society would be useful if properly conducted with zeal and spirit. C supposed that many others felt the same way, but if they did, they were slow to come forward. Nothing more appeared in the press until December 1887, when the JC confidently reported that steps were being taken to found the society. This news provoked a letter of objection from Isidore Harris of the West London Synagogue and Jews College, later the editor of the Jewish Yearbook. He argued that there was little interest in Anglo-Jewish history because it was of little importance, a merely subsidiary subject with a prominence out of all proportion to its place in any rational scheme of Jewish studies. This abstruse branch of research, as he called it, was in any case already well covered by lectures at the Jews College Literary Society. Lucien Wolff and Joseph Jacobs both replied trenchantly, but nothing further was reported until June 1888, when the JC announced that a special meeting had been held. Wolff and Jacobs had been provisionally appointed honorary secretaries, and a prospectus had been issued with a view to launching the society in the autumn. Autumn came and went without further news, and apart from some encouraging words of Hermann Adler's reported in the Jewish press in February 1889, the phantom pregnancy simply faded away. It was the shame of barrenness which finally produced action. The foundation of the American Jewish Historical Society in 1892 placed England in the role of Rachel to the American Leah. In January 1893, the JC reported that the chief rabbi had strongly advocated the formation of an Anglo-Jewish Historical Society. And 2 weeks later, this was followed by a stinging leading article. "We English Jews have grown so accustomed to the charge of neglecting Jewish studies of all kinds that it has almost ceased to affect us. It is a glaring anomaly that we should give such faint indications of that historic sense which is one of the surest notes of intellectual progress. We have allowed the American Jews to beat us in the honourable race." For the first time, the idea was taken up beyond the Jewish press. The London Evening Standard observed, "The Jewish Chronicle uses a polite term in calling the indifference of its English co-religionists an anomaly. Gentile culture does not hesitate to use the word disgrace." Finally, on the 12th of May 1893, the JC was able to report that the often proposed Anglo-Jewish Historical Society will within the next few weeks become an actuality. 1 week later, it announced the date for a special meeting, the 3rd of June 1893, with Lucien Wolff presiding. The long-expected child was on its way, but it was to prove a difficult birth. An influential group believed the society should focus on Jewish history in general, rather than Anglo-Jewry in particular. On the day before the meeting, the JC threw its weight behind this suggestion. At the meeting itself, as we've heard, Frederick David Mercator and Claude Goldsmith Montefiore both repeated Isidore Harris's argument that the history of Anglo-Jewry alone would not produce enough material of general interest. The debate was described by the JC as spirited and prolonged, and by the Manchester Courier, which seems to have sent its own reporter, as stormy and acrimonious. In the end, the resolution to restrict the Society's research and publications to Jews of the British Empire was carried by 6 votes. The Manchester Courier, welcoming the newborn, saw it as evidence that Israel in England is rapidly becoming more British and less Oriental. It is awakening to the fact that it, too, has a position in the historical development of this country's greatness. It is said that success has many fathers. Once the Society was up and running, everyone came to admire the new infant and to say that it was just what they'd always wanted. The prospectus, launched in September 1893, was praised in both the Jewish and the mainstream press. Indeed, the JC performed a volte-face, announcing that the Society has done wisely to restrict its main energy to the history of the Jews of England. In October, it reported that the Society already had 150 members, many of them Gentile dignitaries and academics. By the time of the Society's first meeting on the 11th of November 1893, which the JC hailed as a social and literary success, there were 200 members. The paper was pleased to note that many of them were ladies. Within a few years, the JHSE had, as Isidore Harris feared, eclipsed the historical lectures at the Jews College Literary Society. And the rest, as they say, is history. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you so much. How extremely interesting. There's so many pieces there from the press that I didn't know and I've never read. So Caroline, this is a really wonderful contribution. Thank you so much. And also this idea that, you know, that like their neighbors, the Jews of England are a polite and commercial people, but somewhat Philistine is quite amusing, because Pinchas Roth will be smiling, because that is a very much an accepted view that the Jews of England in the Middle Ages were sort of really dull when it came to learning and poetry and whatnot. And he's committed himself to showing that that is just a false picture created by the lack of sources. And he is finding ingenious ways of dispelling that, disproving that prejudice. And Adrienne Boyarin, who's also here, is working alongside him and particularly emphasizing the role of women in that. So it's interesting to think why these early histories were so important to the founders, and they contributed their own research. And just before we move on to Dean Irwin, who will illuminate us on this, further, just to remind you that, as we saw, Lucien Wolf, with his wealth of languages, felt confident enough even to tackle the sort of languages required in order to study the Inquisition, those Inquisition records. And just to remind you that we have an event on Thursday coming up, information about which is on the JHSE website, a very interesting event it will be, because it marks the completion of a cycle of publications of the reports on Jews within the Portuguese Inquisition. This is mostly early modern material. And this was a long-standing project of collaboration between the JHSE many decades back under the auspices of Richard Barnett. And in his memory, we will have this event where we will celebrate the last volume. We will hear a learned lecture about the Inquisition and the Jews, the Portuguese Inquisition and the Jews. It is free, it is open, and information about it is available. So that's next Thursday. If Lucien Wolf was interested in the Jews and the Inquisition, well, we should follow in his footsteps. I hope to see many of you there. But we will continue now with 1893 and the aspiration of the founders, who are emerging from your wonderful contributions as real characters. And to Dean Irwin.
Thank you, Miri. Can we see that? Hopefully, yes.
Yes, just go to slideshow.
Brilliant. Brilliant. So, oh dear.
Great.
Joseph Jacobs was a scholar of boundless energy and enthusiasm, much like the present president of the Society. Born in Sydney in 1854, Joseph Jacobs, not the present president, he trained as a folklorist at Cambridge. In later life, in America, and become an important contributor to the Jewish Encyclopedia, as well as making contributions to American Jewry statistically. In this brief paper, I want to discuss the middle phase of his life, when he was active in the study and promotion of Anglo Jewry and the Jewish Historical Society. As we've already heard, by the 1880s, there were a growing number of young men in their 20s and 30s looking for a space and place to call their own in their research into Anglo-Jewish history. And this is the background for both the exhibition and the Society. Everything makes much more sense if you understand the ages of the people involved. Jacobs played an important role in the Anglo-Jewish Historical Exhibition of 1887, acting as the honorary secretary of the Literary and Art Subcommittee, and additionally he co-edited the catalogue of the exhibition with Lucien Wolfe and contributed a lecture on the London Jewry prior to the expulsion, which was subsequently published in the volume of exhibition papers. Jacobs also played an important role in defining the legacy of the exhibition. Bibliotheca Anglo-Judaica provides a guide to the bulk of secondary material, which was then in print on the topic, as well as pointers towards the primary source material, as David has already mentioned. In 1888, however, he did not regard the Society as an automatic follow-on of the work of the exhibition. And indeed, neither Jacobs nor F.D. McCarter thought the Society was a very good one. Jacobs went so far as to remark that, quote, England perhaps presents the least attractive field of any historical research when compared to other countries. And I cannot but believe that an Anglo-Jewish Historical Society would, 5 or 6 years after its creation, die of inanition. End quote. We're more than 5 or 6 years on now, it's worth adding. There is, however, more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents, etc. By the time of the founding of the Society in 1893, he supported the endeavour with, quote, inexhaustible zeal and enthusiasm, end quote. And such was the extent of his commitment that he might well have been the first president of the Society had Wolfe not quite literally have won a coin toss. As it was, Jacobs had to wait 4 years before he took on mantle, succeeding Herman Adler, the chief rabbi, as president in 1897-9. Here he did something quite extraordinary and gave his presidential address not in London, but in Birmingham on the 14th of November 1897, with the aim of popularising the Society beyond the capital. Today, we may take for granted the role and importance of local branches to the work of the Society, and here was the first step towards a national rather than a London-centric endeavour. Particularly showing the fact that we should move out of London. So, moving on to his contribution to medieval Anglo-Jewry. At the core of both the exhibition and the new Society was the desire to, quote, to determine the extent of the material which exists for the compilation of a history of the Jews in England. Jacobs did this by publishing the bulk of the 12th century material in his Jews in Angers in England. Crucially, he did so in English translation, making available tracts which had only been accessible hitherto in deeply anti-Semitic works, such as William Prynne's short Demure to the Jews of 1655-6, and also the Jewish naturalization debates of 1753. It's easy to quibble about Jacobs's volume. Some of the translations are imaginative, not all of the sources are legitimate, and certainly not all of the Jews are Jews. Yet it's easy to criticise the volume as beneficiaries of a century of editions and indexes, which simply didn't exist when Jacobs was working. As H.G. Richardson noted in 1960, quote, "The marvel is that he, who had no claim to be a professed medievalist, made it true, and what he had to find manuscripts," end quote. Few sources are so difficult to work with as the pipe rolls recording the debts and payments to the Exchequer. That's the main Exchequer, not the Exchequer of the Jews. Yet in 1889, when the Pipe Roll Society had barely begun its work of publishing editions of these sources, Jacobs published extracts relating to the Jews in the reigns of Henry II and Richard I, and also 1 John. Now, this has always been a mind-numbingly tedious and excruciating laborious task, but at least the manuscripts can be accessed via AALT today, the Anglo-American legal tradition, and I've done that for the 1270s to the 1320s. And here's just a random debt relating to the Jews in the Pipe Roll of 1330-31. Jacobs, in contrast, had to go to Chancery Lane in London and work through 30 years of rolls. There's Mabel Mills, a photo which we owe to Richard Cassidy, who's the wonderful expert on pipe rolls. But Jacobs went to the Chancery Lane and worked through 30 years of rolls, membrane by membrane, an act which highlights not only his commitment to Anglo Jewry, but also his stamina, given that the pipe rolls are not for the faint of heart or soft of spirit. Just 2 more points on the Jews of Angers. First, it was published 3 years before the life and passion of William of Norwich, which necessarily changed the way that we approach 12th century Jewry forever. How different would Jacobs' volume have been had he had access to Thomas of Monmouth's work? Second, although much of the material is administrative, Jacobs' volume allows us to access people of the 12th century Anglo Jewry and their lives. For the convenience of readers, he even appended 2 lists of all the Jews of whom he was aware in that volume, which runs to 748 entries. For those who have been through many hundreds or indeed thousands of Latin entries to find but a handful of Jews, and we are all too few, Jacobs laid the solid foundations upon which we continue to build today. One final point by way of... In his 1897 presidential lecture, Jacobs noted that of Anglo-Jewish history can surely claim all Englishmen and Jews who have care for the destinies of mankind, end quote. The fact that a century on from the foundation of the society, a non-Jew is given this paper hopefully shows how far we've come towards achieving Jacobs' vision. I am not, of course, the first to do so, and for many decades, historians of all religions and none have been writing medieval Anglo-Jewish history. As a field, we've never been more diverse, either in terms of personal belief or gender or social background. And this is the field as it was at Pinchas's conference at last year, I think. So that makes the future incredibly exciting. There is also a general appetite for Anglo-Jewish history in Britain, and although much work needs to be done in order to engage with such audiences, the fact shows that 130 years on, Jacobs' vision never been more important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean. And to that last point, that clearly the history of Jews in medieval England does capture the imagination. When Dean and I last autumn offered the Historical Association a six session over the winter fortnightly course sort of thing about the Jews of medieval England that we were to offer just ourselves, 500 people signed up. And that is members of the Historical Association, it's members, which includes teachers, members of the public, some academics, not many. So it very much is in keeping with that vision that we just heard about before in Caroline's talk about this combination of the appealing to scholars, but also to the public. And that's really, really important. I think it was in Caroline's, or maybe it was in yours, Dean. In any case, it's all been so interesting. So we move on now. Indeed, that picture is a perfect segue to Pinchas Roth himself, the organizer of that, what looked like an extremely jolly event. I, I'm afraid, had to join only online, didn't I, to some of the sessions, because I had to stay here. But Pinchas, you who are doing such extraordinary work alongside Dean and Adrienne and others, but you have something very special to offer us this evening, which we decided on in consultation. So there we are. I won't, tease you all. He is about to present it himself.
Thank you very much, Miri, for those warm words of welcome and for inviting me to take part in this really nice event. So the person I chose to speak about tonight is Myer Davis, who, as you may have heard before, is the great uncle, is that right, of David, who spoke earlier. What I want is to use him as a prism on, as it says in my title, The Search for Medieval English Rabbis. So I'll get started. Myer David Davis was born in London in 1830 and died in 1912. In 1912, in a presidential address on the origins of the Jewish Historical Society of England that you've already heard about tonight, Lucien Wolff declared that the study of Anglo-Jewish history by English Jews, at its sources and for its own sake, had no history of its own previously to 1869, when the late Mr. Myer Davis first began to give the results of his self-denying labors to the world. Wolff mentioned the year 1869 because that was the point at which Davis began to publish short pieces in the Jewish Chronicle and other Jewish periodicals, providing snippets of information that he had gleaned about the medieval history of Jews in England. But Davis is best known for his edition of the Shtarot, as we saw before, or in its English title, The Hebrew Deeds of English Jews Before 1290. This volume was published in 1888, which was 1 year after the Anglo-Jewish Historical Exhibition, where many of these deeds had been displayed to the public with English abstracts prepared by Davis himself. These Shtarot, Davis published 208 of them in his volume. They were all legal documents. Although they were varied in their specifics, they include sales of land, rentals, betrothal agreements, documents relating to different aspects of loans. Their unremittingly legal nature seems to have been a cause of frustration for Davis. Their description in the catalogue of the Anglo-Jewish exhibition notes that these form our only guide to the inner life of the Jewish communities at the time, albeit mainly confined to their legal relations. In the introduction to his edition in this volume the following year, Davis wrote more explicitly that these documents throw considerable light on the internal life of the early Jews in this country and deserve publication on this account alone, especially as there are no judicial responsions or important literary productions by early English Jews. These comments express a palpable regret that early English Jews, as Davis called them, did not produce written compositions of a different type, specifically works of rabbinic scholarship. Just to give you a sense of what these look like, this is the first document in Davis's edition, and he provides the year and the place and Westminster where the document is found. And already from the first three words, B'fanenu chatumei mata hoda, we can see that this is a legal document that was signed by a court, a Jewish court. I believe that Davis's regret was directed not only at medieval English Jews, but also at his own contemporaries and even at himself. In 1888, that same year, very shortly after the publication of his book, Davis sent a letter to the Jewish Standard, which was the English organ of orthodoxy that had begun publication that same year. And in this letter, as you can see, he writes, understanding that you count among your subscribers and readers a goodly number of Hebrew and rabbinical scholars, I venture to ask some of them to assist me in an inquiry I am instituting. the volume of Shtarot that just appeared brings to light the existence during the 13th century of several English-born Rabbonim. I forward a list of these and would fain ask rabbinical scholars and students to furnish me with any references they may have met with that mention the abode, career, or any particulars indeed of these eminent rabbis. Davis's obsequious appeal to rabbinical scholars came from an awareness of his own limitations, his lack of proficiency with the rabbinic texts that might contain the references he hoped would come to light. His appeal was in fact answered 2 weeks later, when the Reverend Naphtali Levy published a column suggesting identifications of 5 rabbis mentioned in medieval rabbinic sources. And in subsequent issues, Levy added further names. Now, Naphtali Levy was born in Poland. He was trained in traditional yeshivot. Like many yeshiva students at the time, he took an interest in more critical approaches to Jewish history, and he spent time in Breslau and Posen among scholars and maskilim. Arriving in England in 1876, Levy had hoped to devote himself to scholarly pursuits, but found himself toiling as a shochet, a ritual slaughterer of poultry. And, slaughtering poultry is even less interesting than slaughtering larger animals. He had long sought out connections with scholars, even exchanging letters with Charles Darwin in 1874, before he arrived in England. In his series of replies in the Jewish Standard, Levy provided just the sort of information that Davis had hoped for, ostensible references to English rabbis in the Tosafot and Sefer Mordechai. The Tosafot are glosses on the Talmud, compiled in medieval France and printed alongside and around the Talmudic text in all standard editions of the Babylonian Talmud. And Sefer Mordechai is a compilation of response and interpretations by medieval French and German rabbis that is published as an appendix to many standard editions of the Babylonian Talmud. The point I'm trying to make is, Levy located English rabbis in rabbinic texts that were on the one hand inaccessible to an anglicized scholar such as Myer Davis, but on the other hand they were located in plain sight for traditionally trained rabbis in easily accessible and even canonical works. So the purpose of this joint enterprise was not simply to locate further information about the medieval figures, but to crown these medieval English Jews as English Rabbonim, who could claim the place of Anglo Jewry within the rabbinic canon. Both Davis and Levy made further use of their exchange in the pages of the Jewish Standard. Davis incorporated the findings into his own works, allowing Lucien Wolff to later say that he, Davis, was the first English scholar to call attention to the references to English Jews in the Tosafot. And Levy, for his part, translated Davis's letter into Rabbinic Hebrew and composed a much lengthier reply that he published, first in a journal of rabbinic scholarship published in Jerusalem, and afterwards in a volume of Levy's own response titled Nachalat Naphtali. And you see the title page of his volume before you now. This anecdote, and it really is just an anecdote about the newspaper exchange between Myer Davis and Naphtali Levy, reminds me how diverse the uses of history can be. And here I'm really following in the wake of things that Miri said earlier tonight, and how even the self-same historical sources and facts can resonate in different ways for different people. The history of Jews in England has long been, and I think still is, a particularly rich example of the changing uses of history. If I return to those Hebrew deeds, the Shtarot that were first published by Davis in 1888, in recent years, they were all republished by Professor Judith Elshovi-Schlanger, who carefully studied their linguistic and paleographical features, which are aspects that were virtually ignored by Davis and by other early scholars. The financial information these Shtarot contain has been studied by scholars such as the late and lamented Rubin Mandel and Yibadel ben Chaim L'Chaim, my friend Dean Irwin, whom we heard tonight. And there are still more aspects that still remain to be fully uncovered and considered. I'll add that in terms of rabbinic scholarship, that really is something that I've been working on for a number of years now. And just to illustrate what I'm trying to do, these are manuscripts of medieval rabbinic texts. This is Sefer Mordechai that I mentioned before, and I think the other ones are as well. But here in the margins, you can see extracts, passages that are attributed here to English rabbis. So I've been trying to gather them together and to create a critical edition that will really help us properly understand what those English rabbis were actually doing. So over time, our knowledge increases, but our questions change, and the kinds of answers that we find satisfying also shift. I think that the Jewish Historical Society of England has done an admirable job of providing the resources for asking the relevant questions, posing the relevant answers, and telling the relevant story of Jews in England throughout its existence, and will continue to do so for many years to come. So thank you very much for allowing me to take part in this exciting event. And I look forward to doing more of this work together.
Thank you so much, Pinchas, and I hope people appreciate just how difficult the work is that you're doing and what extraordinary skills are required in order to be able to execute it. Thank you very much. So we've heard our 4 speakers. There's been interesting convergence. There's been interesting, also great originality, I think, in each one of them. I've just enjoyed every minute of it, quite frankly. And it's a good thing that we're recording this and that others will be able to benefit as well. So let us spend a little bit of time now, because it is after all Sunday night. And but I think there will be questions.